Hi everybody. We had some problems that were really problematic with our audio, and I just wasn't able to talk with you very easily. So I'm sorry for the disruption. I wanted to get back with you and do this live streaming with you and not provide that for you this evening. I'm happy to be here. I'm hoping that uh, some folks will come on and join us. I think they will be. Sometimes people join a little later. But tonight's live streaming is about getting your family of origin out of you. And the reason why that's such an important topic, and that's an important topic in my own work, because the work of self differentiation, which I have been talking about in my videos for many years, the work of self differentiation is about finding our real selves and not just living as our family self. And so many of us do live our family self versus our real self, our authentic self. And we struggle with that in our relationships, in life, in our directions, in career, and all kinds of ways that it impacts us. What do I mean by having the family of origin within us or the family of origin within me? And what I mean by that is the intergenerational transmission of the family emotional process within us. In other words, we don't just inherit, uh, and again, talking about what it means to have the family of origin inside you, we're not just talking about how the family passes on genes or genetically. Certainly, I think you've noticed, and I think people have told me, and they have said, "Hey, Jerry, you look like your dad, you know, and your son looks like you, and et cetera, et cetera. My granddaughter may look like my aunt." Certainly, genetically, we have those appearances in which we look like our family of origin. But genes are not the only thing that we pass on in a very real way. And in fact, there are authors and many theorists who talk about the the family organism, meaning it's an organism of life, and we're a part of that organism, and that includes generations back. And much like you would see some of that, and let's say if you do some archaeology on the family, and I mean emotional archaeology, let's say if you go back to um, a great uncle who commits suicide and causes trauma within the family. And that trauma gets passed down through the generations. And in fact, they're even doing research, which I think is even more amazing, when they're talking about cells having memory within it, within the membrane of the cell, and that those memories can go back to trauma within family generations past. And so there's a lot that is passed on. And not only are those things passed on, but let me give you some other things that get passed on to us when I talk about having the family of origin within me. First of all, we're talking about having a family self. When you're an infant, you don't have a self. You have your parent self, your mother's self, or some even go back to the breast self. The baby doesn't know it's them. All they know are they are one with mom, one with their caregiver. And so there's a fusion and an enmeshment when we're very, very young. And then as we get older, the normal process is for that fusion to begin to come apart where the child becomes more of an individual, more themselves. And then throughout life, throughout adult life, they become more and more themselves versus the family self or that enmeshed self from long ago. And that developed self is a more self differentiated self. In other words, they're still a part of the family, but they're themselves. So they're still connected while being themselves. And actually, that's a definition of self differentiation, being connected while being yourself. So, what are some of those things that get passed down besides genes or genetically? Levels of self differentiation. If the family operates on a 0 to 10 level of self differentiation, or we can call it maturity, if the family operates at about a level of a 3, then more than likely the child is going to grow up and become an adult and have more of a 3-ness about them. It would be rare, and I'm not sure how it would necessarily work, if you have someone who is born into a 3, when they hit 18, their self differentiation level of 9. I just think that's highly, highly unlikely. We tend to share the self differentiation level of our family, how mature our family is. Now, that doesn't mean that's a life sentence. We can change that level of self differentiation through our own growth, through our own healing, recovery, maturity. We can change that level and hopefully increase the level for our next generation or our children or ourselves. And we begin, and people will talk about breaking the cycle. If you've got an abusive cycle of abuse after abuse after abuse, and then someone's going to break the cycle, focus on themselves, recover or heal, and not be abusive, they're beginning to break that cycle and raise the level of self differentiation for their children, and on and on. But it often doesn't get all fixed in one generation. I think people talk about it being like we're the product of like 5 past generations, when actually biologically, we're a product of many, many hundreds of thousands of generations, is really who we have come to be, because we go way, way back. And we're still a part of that line. So self differentiation is one thing. Unresolved issues. If a family has unresolved issues, one of the principles that I talk about is, for example, whatever emotional issues I don't resolve for me as an adult from my past or as me individually, then my son gets to resolve them. I pass them on to him to resolve. And I think families will pass on those issues, and if they don't resolve them, they leave it for the next generation to resolve it. And so, what we want to do for our children and for ourselves is to resolve those issues so that we can give them a better opportunity to grow, be healthy, have a higher level of self differentiation and maturity and health. The losses and grief that we experience is another thing that can get passed on. Traumas can get passed on. Birth order is certainly something that gets passed on. Are you the youngest? Are you the oldest? Are you the middle child? Are you one of 10 or an only child? That can have a lot to do with what gets passed on to you. Emotional cutoffs. You can have a cutoff between your parents' generation. There can be a cutoff there that ends up affecting you. And same is true with triangles. If we have emotional triangles, then again, it's those triangles get passed on to us. And we'll find ourselves getting into triangles because our parents got into triangles, their parents got into triangles, their family got into triangles, and we continue to get into triangles too, emotional triangles, which can be really problematic. And emotional triangles are basically a symptom of immaturity. They are basically a symptom of immaturity. And so the we want to remember that, again, what we resolve helps the next generation to be healthier. Then there are beliefs, assumptions, prejudices, fears that get passed on generationally from this generation to the next, from my parents to me, and from my grandparents to my parents. And those get passed on generationally. And we can begin to resolve those. I know one of the things my mother did, for example, she was very afraid of dogs. She didn't want us to be afraid of dogs, so she overcame that fear or did not make it predominant and allowed us to interact with dogs and to play with them or have them. But I know she wasn't comfortable with dogs at all, and she had a fear of them. And then, interestingly enough, I got bit by a collie when I was delivering newspapers as a young kid, and that was rather traumatic for me. So I've always had little issues with collies, and I know collies can be wonderful. They're a little high strung, but they can be great. But it was a trauma that I experienced. Now, of course, the families can pass on generational uh, strengths as well: fortitude, courage, compassion, empathy, strength of principle or belief. That's not rigid or kind of anal. It's not a rigid or black and white, but someone has really good values, knows themselves, and hold on and have some good principles and beliefs. But what I found is nobody comes to me for these kinds of issues. Hey, I've got too much courage. Jerry, can you help me out? Um, or Jerry, I've got too much empathy. Can you help me out? Though sometimes we can have toxic empathy and toxic compassion. Or I live my beliefs too much. Jerry, can you help me with that? Again, that's typically not what people come and want to get help for. They want to get help for the problems and issues that have been uh, passed along down through the generations. Um, I've got a question that someone has asked. I think it's Walken. And let me take a look at this. Can no contact with your family end up being mentally healthy or mentally healthy, uh, struggling with guilt of not helping them is what you're dealing with. Well, guilt, I think, is a big. What's interesting, like what I find is when someone experiences a lot of guilt with their family of origin, they're dealing with their family self within them. That's not yourself, that's your family self. Because oftentimes we feel guilty for rather irrational things or no need to feel guilty about them. If you come to your parents' house and you like vegetarian food, you just say, "Well, that's okay. You can cook for everybody. I'll just bring vegetarian food with me, and I'll just eat with everyone then." And the parents get upset. Why can't you eat this? We've worked so hard on this food, and then you're supposed to feel guilty. That's not real guilt. That's family self guilt. It's the self of the family that's producing that guilt within you. Because why would it matter whether you ate vegetarian or mom's food or whatever? She's now getting hurt because you're not eating her food. Don't you find that interesting? That's an immature response by mom. That if you're not going to eat my food, I'm going to pout and be upset about it. That's not an age appropriate reaction. What you do is go, well, you're welcome to eat that food. If you'd like to eat the vegetarian food that you bring, or if you'd like me to cook you something vegetarian, I'd be happy to do that. That's a more adult response rather than you're hurting me for not eating the food I have prepared. You're not joining and fusing with everyone doing the same thing, but you don't want to and don't need to. And there's no need for there to even be a conflict about it. I don't make other people fix my diet if I have to eat a certain way. They're not responsible for that. I am. And I understand when I go to a big family dinner, that's not all the food that I want to eat or should eat. So I will eat what I can and leave the rest. Oh, well, you're not eating enough. Why aren't you doing that? Well, there's the whole food pushing issue. Um, but I'm not, I don't want to do that. That's just my choice. Um, and can going no contact with your family end up being mentally healthy? The if here's my going no contact decision should be based on a mature, calm, reasoned response and beliefs. That's what going no contact should be based on. It should not be based on reactivity, and it should not be based on immaturity. In other words, I just don't like what my family's doing, so I'm just going to cut them off. Oh, I don't. Who does like everything their family does? But if a family is toxic, abusive, just beyond the pale, then there may be a reasonable decision to have no limited or no contact with them. But that is an adult decision. It's not an emotional reaction. So we always need to decide if I'm having trouble with my family, does this require greater self-differentiation on my part, or does this require no contact? And oftentimes people will get that question wrong. And if they just need to be more self-differentiated, they'll just choose no contact. Well, that can be problematic. And then there are others who probably should choose no contact, and they're trying to be mature within this very toxic and abusive relationship. And that's unwise as well. So when it comes to no contact walking, I hope that helps you with that question. You're free to write questions to me if anybody has one and would like to ask more. Again, I want to mention there's only a few spots left for the workshop that's coming up. And so, and in fact, as I understand, there's only one spot left for this workshop. So we're very encouraged by that. I think it's going to be a really good experience for us. The so I think I think I've got a question coming here, but I'll go ahead and mention about how do we get our family of origin out of us? And of course, I can give you three easy ways, but of course, it takes a lifetime to work these out. So, and they're not easy ways. I shouldn't even say that, but they are the work of getting our family out of us. And also, when I think of getting the family out of me by being self-differentiated. And I do want to mention, I'm talking about differentiation from an enmeshed situation. And differentiation doesn't mean cut off. It doesn't mean no contact, except in certain situations, no contact's appropriate. But what I want to do is separate from the family self, because all families have a family self, or we call it the family super self, and everybody partakes of it. And if you don't believe me, try to go against the family and see what happens. just with your own opinion or your own beliefs. Um, and so I think you can see what I mean. And what are all those pingings and reactions about, and the anxiety that's created when you don't go along with the family view, beliefs, emotional field, etc.? What happens? And what happens is the family gets perturbed, and the family gets pinged, and then you can see, oh, that's the family super self that's being affected, um, because you're not playing within the family super self. Um, so those ways, very simply, and I can talk more, and I'll also be talking more in the workshop. Uh, Self-awareness, self-definition, and self-regulation. We work on those three things. Now, there's a lot to all of those, but at least those are the basics, and I think they're very important. And my whole life is geared towards self-awareness, self-definition, and self-regulation. That's my work of being an adult and being mature. And I will spend the rest of my life doing that. I don't know that I will ever arrive. I do not think I'll ever be a 10 on the self-differentiation. No, I'm not. But I'd sure like to be a 6 rather than a 2, um, because life is very much different at 6 than it is at a 2. Now, our Torres has a question. I have CPTSD. I am a teacher and I don't know how to deal with conflict with people. Oh, that's an excellent question. And I assume maybe your CPTSD came from family of origin, or and that's a tricky one, because our our limbic system, that old brain back there, that the fight or flight, that very deep part of our brain gets triggered with CPTSD. And the way I think about PTSD and CPTSD, PTSD is more of a unitary, or a single or a couple events that are just really traumatic and acute. CPTSD is chronic and more long term, in and being repeated. It might be a smaller trauma, but it's repeated over and over and over again. And I think of this: if you have a parent who is just shaming and just criticizing, just just in an unholy way, to their children, okay, that's a traumatic event. But if that's happening every other day or every day, that becomes a CPTSD experience, because now it's a longer term daily thing that I'm being traumatized over and over and over again. So when you're talking about CPTSD and conflict, we actually have two issues. One is the CPTSD, and one is dealing with conflict. Oftentimes, we're not able to regulate our anxiety enough, which hurts us in dealing with conflict. Because if we have too much anxiety, we just want to avoid conflict. And I think a part of the reason why we might have trouble with conflict, and I've never met you, R. Torres, so I don't know your situation, but I've met some people who might have asked me this question in the past. And if you've got too much anxiety going on, it's going to be really hard to allow the other person to be on their side of the tennis net. In other words, when we have CPTSD and we want to avoid conflict, we feel everybody's jumped over the net and is on our side of the tennis net. And we're trying to play tennis, and they've jumped over here and right in our face. And we have all of this anxiety. So, a part of the work of healing is beginning to work on how do we get them and doing the work of getting them to be on the other side of the tennis net. Also, for me, caring less and becoming more detached. And that can be worked on. There are things that can be done to help with that. Um, and then, certainly, if you have CPTSD, we want to manage that separately. By the way, there's a great workbook called the CPTSD Workbook, I believe. It's a very good workbook you might want to take a look at. And I can't remember the author right off the bat, but I think it's a she, and it's a good workbook because you want to work on your CPTSD, and then you also want to work on your self differentiation, meaning um, they can be who they are on their side of the tennis net, and I can be who I am on my side of the tennis. And so I'm able to more than communicate my own views. They may disagree, but they're free to disagree. If they want to disagree, they are free to do that. And they can have their own opinions. Um, and I have a right to say no. That's another book I might suggest. When I say no, I feel guilty. And again, that's for those conflict avoiders. When I say no, I feel guilty. And that might be a book you may want to consider. The Because it really helped me to deal with what it meant to say no. Because I just couldn't say no to anybody because I would either feel so guilty or I'd have such a hard time with that. And the when I have that kind of reaction, then I want to avoid conflict. I never want to disagree with anyone. Disagreement requires practice, and we don't have to practice with the most anxiously intense situation. You start with low anxiety situations and begin to say no. For example, or your husband or your wife says, "Hey, well, we're going to the Mexican restaurant tonight." "Well, honey, I'd really rather go to a different place." "Oh, well, where do you want to go?" "Well, I might want to go to Chinese tonight." That's saying no in a relatively low level anxious situation. Then there's moderate anxiety, and then there's high anxiety. Um, the high anxiety comes when we say, "No, I'm not coming for the holiday on that day, Mom, because we want to have our own holiday at our house." Generally, that causes a big furor. Or, "I'm going to go to college, or I'm not going to go to college, or I'm going to do this, or I'm going to do that." When we feel like we're going against someone uh, in our family. The So I would just make those recommendations for you. I don't know if that answers all of your issues, but I would also recommend you might get someone to help work with you on that in particular, in terms of conflict avoidance. I certainly went through decades of not wanting to have any conflict with anyone, and that just really is difficult, because then we don't share how we feel. I have another question, and this is by Corey. I always have my mom's voice in my head. It prevents me from doing things in life that I want to do, such as getting a tattoo or bungee jumping and having as much safe sex as I want to have. And any advice? Well, I think you're not alone, Corey, in having mom or dad's voice in your head. That's very common. And I think when I work with folks who complain about something like that, I will usually ask them about um, what are the downsides of going against the voice? What are your fears and what are the downsides? Because, you may have a voice in your head says, "Don't ever get a tattoo." And I know people differ on tattoos, whether to get them or not get them, but I'm not trying to, judge that issue. I'm just, if that's something you're an adult and in this country you can legally get a tattoo. Um, and that uh, if you choose to do that, then you can, if it's a mature, thought out process and something you would like to do. Though maybe everybody else in the family would never get a tattoo. Um, and that's okay. They don't have to. And you're not saying, I'm better than you because I got a tattoo. I'm worse than you because I, you know, got a tattoo. No, it's for you not a moral issue. And that what would be the downsides of going against the voice? And then, second of all, you could do some journaling about the voice and have the voice talking to you and you talk back to it in the journaling. Um, I also want to know, and I would want to know what kind of feelings come up for you when you hear the voice. Is it guilt? Is it anxiety, fear, trepidation, worthlessness? I mean, it could be it just a number of different feelings that might come up with that. And then I would want to work through those feelings. Um, and then also, I'd want to work through the issues of when does parenting end for me? And if you're an adult, then mom's voice inside you would be inappropriate. Not that moms have nothing good to say or dads don't have good things to say. Of course, many times there would be uh, good advice that parents would have. But we have to begin to learn to have our own advice and to choose what we believe and what our principles are in terms of being an adult. And that we also may have feelings of maybe anger about having that voice. And that anger can be also worked through as well. Because if it just keeps coming up, then you want to begin to address it. Um, and I hope that's a help to you, Corey. I think if there's, um, you might want to take a look at the book Inner Bonding by Margaret Paul. That could maybe give you some help about your feelings and about your inner child in there and how it interacts with this voice. I think that might be helpful to you. Um, so, when I talk about how do we get the family of origin out of us, the I've got a few more questions here, and I'll come back here. How we get the family of origin out of us? Self awareness, self definition, self regulation. Can I be aware of what's going on inside of me? Am I being aware? Have I become aware? Many of us are pretty immature in that awareness. Second of all, self definition. What do I believe? What's important for me as an adult? What do I value? What do I not value? Many of us tend to be more on the immature side for um, self definition. Thirdly, self regulation. How am I going to function in this situation and in this relationship and in my adult relationships? And those three things are backed up by learning systems thinking, which again will be a part of the workshop. I'm going to be doing some videos for the participants and they'll be able to listen to those prior to our sessions. Um, Backed up by greater self differentiation and maturity, that we want to become more mature. What would somebody my age do? How would they act? How would they respond? If I'm yelling and screaming, that's probably not age appropriate, more than likely. If I'm a 2-year-old, that might be a little more appropriate. And that's okay. That's not unhealthy. It's age appropriate. Now, I don't think yelling and screaming for 3 days is appropriate for a 2 or 3-year-old, but I think that's appropriate. But an adult doing that, now we're way out of the realm of maturity. Backing it, and these things being backed up with inner child work, reparenting work, and again, I think one definition of immaturity, what is that? Immaturity, uh, that, or what is maturity? Maturity is to express and experience one's feelings in an age-appropriate way. And I think that's very important. A teenager may pout for 5 days or 2 weeks because they had a bad interaction with mom and dad. That may be more appropriate for a teenager. But when an adult does this, then he or she is emotionally immature. We don't want to be pouting for 5 days or 2 weeks. That's not emotional maturity. I've got a question from Metaphor. The My family not only gave me toxic shame to feel isolated and inferior from others, and the guilt of having relationships with outsiders. How do I practice self differentiation and make friends? Hmm. That's a great question. You guys are making me work tonight. Why are you doing this? I gotta put some effort into this. But I'm glad you're asking the question. I appreciate you joining me. The um, Certainly we can get toxic shame, uh, and that we should feel isolated and inferior from others can certainly be an inheritance that we get from our family of origin. And we can feel guilty if we have relationships with people outside the family or others. And when somebody says, how do I practice self differentiation and make friends? It is oftentimes, it's not so much about the how, it is the when. Oftentimes we ask how questions. Many times they are when questions. And so I would say, well, when are you ready and when do you want to start making friends from outsiders, or start having friends while giving up the toxic shame? When do you want to do that? And people will say, oh, I want to do that right now. That's why I'm asking you, which is not a crazy notion. Uh, what I would challenge them with is, if you were to give up your toxic shame, if you were to give up feeling inferior, if you were to give up the rule against having relationships with outsiders or people outside the family, what would be the downsides for you? What would be the downsides of doing that metaphor? And metaphor is who's asking the question. Because it is those things that you want to work on. What would be the downsides? And people sometimes say, well, if I didn't have this toxic shame, I'd probably stand up for myself more with family and with other people. And since I'm afraid to do that, I'll just keep holding on to the toxic shame. because that just makes it easier for me, then I just won't. Um, and that because shame is something that we inherit or get from others, because that's a feeling in which we are an outsider, a feeling in which there's something very wrong with us. And so that healing process is beginning to focus on self compassion, self love, and self differentiation. And in which I start to go, wait a minute, um, I am not inferior. I know I have feelings like that, and I know I have thoughts like that, but I truly am not inferior. I'm just a human being like everybody else, and everybody's a human being. Some of us have learned that we are worthless, or that we are bad. And that's what shame is about. You're bad, different, worthless. You don't measure up. You're an outsider. You're an outlier, and you should be either made fun of or ridiculed. You should be ridiculed. And and so we have to begin to develop a different relationship with ourselves. I don't want my relationship with me to be based on what my parents and how they interacted with me. I want to begin to do inner child work, reparenting work, self work. And when I start to learn self compassion, self love, and that's very possible for everyone. Because here's what's an interesting thing. If you can hate yourself, don't you think you could love yourself? What keeps you from, if you can do one, why can't you do the other? I'm not saying the hate's not a strong feeling. I get that. But it's not, you're incapable of doing that. It may be a struggle first. And I can remember several events in which I had turning points in my life, in which I really came down to, gosh, I really have to decide, am I going to be for me or not? Am I going to love me or not? Only I can decide that. My parents can't. My shame voice can't. Nobody can decide that but me. And I'm going to um, begin to love myself. And you can begin to do that again. Inner healing, uh, inner bonding by Margaret Paul is a good one. The inner child work. You can go on Amazon, look up inner child work. You can find a lot of good books on doing the inner child work, because your inner child is feeling the shame, the isolation, the rules, the guilt, and your inner child needs a new parent. You're still letting your parents parent your inner child rather than you parenting your inner child. And that those books can help you refocus that towards you. I hope that's a help metaphor. And I've got Bakir. Bakir. She says, I went no contact with my family, but several years ago, I bought an apartment on my father's name, and he isn't giving it back. What should I do? When I remember, it still hurts. Um, yeah, we can feel pained by past decisions. Zakir, I don't know how old you are, but let's just use Jerry. I'll just use me, for example. Let's say I have that very problem. And, I went no contact with my family, but several years ago, I bought an apartment in my father's name, and he isn't giving it back to me. I'm now 67. What would a 67-year-old do with that old decision? I could fight them about it. I could sue them about it. I don't know if I would win or not, especially if I was uh, very willing in that arrangement and full well knew he was doing it under his name, though it was supposed to be for me. But if there wasn't some kind of legal agreement about that, then, you know, I may be just out of luck because they can uh, be challenge you about that. Um, Now that it's already passed, and now that your relationship has soured, it's hard to mend that old issue. So again, I could put up a fight, I can ask them, I could threaten them, I suppose, but I want to make sure I would want to do that with an attorney, that I have some legal basis for it. The other is I can ask them in an adult, mature way and say, this is, I think it would be more fair if you gave it back to me because I was the one who bought it, but it was in your name. For whatever reasons, you had to do it at that time. But again, if someone has their legal name on it, then, and if we agreed to it, then we agreed to it. I may want to take my losses and I may want to grieve over those choices or those circumstances so that I can move on so I don't still hit the hurt. I don't want to keep that hurt alive inside me. At least that's been my philosophy. I don't want to carry that hurt. And so if I need to let it go, I can do all that I can, but that's all that I can do. And the serenity prayer is again that good rule that we use, do what you can, but and change what you can change, but what you can't change, God help me accept that. Because I need to, and then deal with the hurt and the grief and grieve through the hurt of that. There's nothing wrong with grieving through that. And we've all made poor choices. We've all done things that didn't turn out very well. Or we did it back when we were more immature or maybe in a financially difficult position. And so we've all done those kinds of things, and we have to do our grief work about it. If we can repair it or fix it or get it back, we do. If we can't, then we need to grieve and go on. I hope that helps, Bakir. 12 brothers. Um, can a person have CPTSD their entire life, which stem from childhood? Well, I suppose, yeah. I I think that, I mean, certainly people can have it for many, many years. I mean, I've known of people in their later ages who have been experiencing CPTSD. They're 70 years old, 80 years old, and probably have had it for a long, long time. Um, so I think you can have it for your entire life. Um, it would be unfortunate if uh, if they didn't get an opportunity to address that, to at least bring down the symptoms, help them manage the automatic reactivity of that, and maybe even to heal from some of that trauma. And there are some therapies, there's some coaching that can help with CPTSD. And so I don't think it's kind of like when somebody says, well, can somebody have depression all their life? Of course, yes, you can have clinical depression all your life, but I think there's enough options treatment-wise that we can do to make depression much more livable or resolved or healed or there are many treatments that can be used to help with some depression so that someone doesn't have to live in just agony and pain their entire life, which many generations before had to. Uh, they did have to do that. Um, and that's unfortunate. And I think we are fortunate living in an opportunity to where we can treat some of these things and get a lot of relief regarding those. Yeah, I just think people do suffer a lot more than they have to because they often don't get the help that they need. And I do know sometimes the help is hard to find or expensive, or I understand that, and I hope that we will do more about helping provide more help for people. I do want to say something about YouTube that I think is positive. I grew up. I'm old, so I grew up in an age of no YouTube, and to find out information, I think, was much more difficult. I mean, you went to a card catalog index, which had all these cards in the library, and you'd look through different topics, try to find books on topics. Well, you only had access to the books that are right there in this library. Now we have access to information all over the world and almost any book and any library anywhere. And so we can, maybe, and I remember the days of encyclopedias. That was kind of your general knowledge kind of reference book. And so, um, not having grown up in a YouTube world or an internet world, now I think there's a lot more information for people that can help them change and be less misery, more recovery, more health because of YouTube and because of the internet. I'm not there saying there's not crazy things out there. There certainly are. Uh, and I think that that's unfortunate, but that's when you have free speech, there's a lot of crazy things that can be out there. Um, and uh, I really want to say that I think a lot of people are being helped for free. Just like my videos, I've probably got 300 plus videos on YouTube. They're all for free, and people have said it's helped them tremendously. And so there are ways to get relief and help even through the internet these days. And speaking of the internet, now we can do workshops and provide that to people in Dubai, Germany, Chile, France, Brazil, Canada, the US, and we can all come together on a workshop and learn about how to get our families out of us. And that's the workshop coming up. I hope you'll join me. There's a couple questions I have here. Metaphor has another question. I want to be in healthy relationships with people, but being with someone seeming to have their things together trigger my toxic shame. Oh, I see. Where should I start to get out of this devious loop? Um, right. And I think if you're having difficulty being with someone who kind of has their life together and it triggers you, then you're probably not quite ready for a relationship. You need to do more self work so that you can be more ready for a good relationship and not be repelled by a decent relationship. And I think doing that self work of working with someone, I think John Bradshaw, I might suggest him as an author in dealing with toxic shame. He's got some great books on shame. I really would. I also have a video on shame, probably more than one. You might want to take a look at those videos, and I do give resources in there because shame is a big deal, and I do know shame personally. Even occasionally, I will get zinged, a little shame, but it's much better than just living in shame the whole time at 24/7. Um, so I would start to do that self work um, because you don't want to go to somebody who might have their life more together and say, oh, well, let's have a relationship, but I don't want you ever to trigger my shame. And I don't want you to ever, reject me or hurt me, um, because I've been hurt so many times in the past. Now let's try to have a good relationship. No, we've just set it up for now a mess. Whenever somebody says, now, I hope you won't abandon me and I hope you won't hurt me, and that's early in the relationship, and the other person says, oh, I'll never do that. I'll never. If that statement has to be stated or asked, we're not ready for a relationship, because more than likely that's what's going to happen. Because if we fear it, then there are going to be dynamics in which our fear will create it. I'm going to use that analogy. Uh, and we don't want it to create that. And that also means when we go and say, I don't want you to ever hurt me, and I've been hurt in the past, I hope you won't do that, then I haven't worked through those old hurts yet. And I'm saying, but I'd like you to kind of be responsible for this. And don't you ever do anything that would hurt me. Well, when you're in a first honeymoon stage, anybody's going, oh, well, I would never do that. No, no. And then come out 6 months, a year later, we have the same thing happening again. So we have to deal with ourselves first and do that self work. And then I've got AM, who writes, how do I differentiate the thoughts of my family from my own personal thoughts? Oh, that's a good that's a good um, question. I think it's a very good question. And in the workshop, I'm going to be answering that question in more detail for people, because that's a great, how do I, or another question I get asked is how, and I have some videos on systems feelings versus true feelings, my true feelings versus systems or family feelings, family self versus authentic self. And what's the difference between the two? How would I know the difference? And so learning that is a great thing about learning about yourself. So learning the difference between those two. My family from my personal thoughts. And I think what happens is, are those thoughts your beliefs, your values, your self definition? Are those thoughts a part of that? Or are those thoughts not what you believe? For example, if I feel, you know, let's say, or a tattoo. I want to go get a tattoo. And I'm fine with getting a tattoo. That's okay with me. I want to get a small tattoo, have my granddaughter, whatever I'm going to do. And I'm going to go do that. But I hear my mom or my family saying, don't you ever do that. That's a bad thing to do. We will reject you. Only bad people get tattoos. And that's going around in my head. Is that a family thought, or is that an authentic thought? I would say it's a family thought, because it's not your thought. That's not your beliefs or your values. Um, and it's also not age appropriate. If I'm 40 years old and I'm hearing my family say, don't do this, well, wait a minute, what have I internalized from the family, and what have I rejected regarding the family? Because we all internalize and we want to take the good and we want to reject the bad. But if the bad is always following me, even into my later adult life, the family going through, because are they my values? Are they my beliefs? My morality? That's what's important. And if they're not, then it's your family, more than likely. And in fact, there are questions. And in fact, if you watch my last video, um, how do you know if your family's within you, or is your family of origin still within you? The last video I put up on YouTube, I talk about, again, how you might discern that, how you might differentiate that. and really taking a look at, you know, what are truly my thoughts, my feelings, and not what I've just inherited or picked up. And I talked about how you can kind of identify the difference between the two. That's a whole discussion I could probably do for an hour, which a great video or a great workshop just to do that. So I hope, AM, that's a help to you, because if it's not your authentic self, then talking, then, oh, I know what I was going to say. If you have those kind of thoughts and you're uncertain, are those my thoughts or my family thoughts? Go ask yourself, when did I first hear this? When did I first think this way? What was my earliest experience of believing this? And if it goes back to 6 years old, 8 years old, it's probably your family talking in you and a family experience uh, talking. If we can take it back and go, gosh, I believed that since I was 6 years old. Um, but it's not really how I feel now as an adult. It's not what I believe or not what I choose. Um, and so, again, that's a way to differentiate or distinguish between those. Well, I'm starting to wind down, and I appreciate you all joining me very much. I really hope you'll sign up for the workshop because I'd like to work with people in small groups, 12 people, and I really hope you'll do that on the website. Um, I want to thank you for listening to me talk all this time. And I want to thank those who asked questions tonight. I hope it was a help to you. And I really want to say thank you to all my viewers and all of those who followed me on my YouTube channel. You can find me on YouTube, Facebook, Instagram. You can find me in all of those places and at my website as well. The website has some new things on it. Go take a look at it. And I want to thank you for joining me tonight. And I will say I hope you have a good evening and a good day. And be wise.